On this episode of Newt's World, tragedy unfolded on April 19th, 1995, when a massive bomb exploded in America's heartland, killing 168 people, including 15 children in their daycare center. History says the Oklahoma City bombing was lone wolf terrorism. But fresh evidence points instead to a neo-Nazi plot in which the FBI played a hidden role, allowing suspects to walk free. The FBI launched the biggest manhunt in its history for two suspected bombers and quickly arrested Timothy McVeigh, a 26-year-old Gulf War Army veteran. Yet they never captured the other suspect, known only as John Doe II, who rode next to McVeigh in the bomb truck. Soon, the FBI canceled the search, saying eyewitnesses who saw John Doe II were mistaken. In her new book, Blowback, Margaret Roberts reopens the mystery of John Doe II and chronicles her shocking discoveries, including journalism's only face-to-face prison interviews with McVeigh co-conspirator Terry Nichols. Here to discuss her new book, I am really pleased to welcome my guest, Margaret Roberts. She is the former news director of America's Most Wanted. Margaret, welcome and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is an honor to be here with you.
You were news director of America's Most Wanted, which was an amazingly successful program. You are deeply familiar with the FBI and criminal investigations, but I want to start with America's Most Wanted because it became such a popular show and in many ways an iconic show that people really cued off of and paid attention to. How did you get to America's Most Wanted?
Well, I was a print journalist, Mr. Speaker, in the very buttoned-down world, which you know very well, of Washington, D.C. policy and politics. I was a top editor at National Journal, and then I moved over to Congressional Quarterly. So it was a very different beat from America's Most Wanted. But what happened was it was a radical media experiment when Barry Diller at Fox decided to take a flyer and put this television show in the backyard of the FBI and propose to them that they partner with Hollywood, basically, to catch criminals. And it was a bold move. And I always have kind of suspected that part of my hiring or choice of me for the job was that I really represented the Washington journalist, not the Hollywood type, but I was the more buttoned-down, conventional one. And they had a lot of explaining and persuading to do to bring the FBI on board for this media experiment.
I've seen the show, but how did it get put together? Did you all sit down with the FBI and look at a range of possibilities, or how would a typical show for America's Most Wanted actually be put together?
Well, I ran the newsroom and the research department, and I was the liaison with the FBI as well as with victims and cops. So my department effort was all about identifying fugitive cases. You know, the FBI would give us files and help us in that way. But delivering and developing fugitive cases and files that would make compelling TV. I mean, not every case would have the story value.
How often did those stories actually lead to finding the criminal you were looking for?
I bet the show captured 1,000 fugitives, but we captured hundreds while I was there, and these were high-profile fugitives. The night of our premiere was an extraordinary moment in television history because there we were at the WTTG television station where we had our headquarters, and there was the FBI, about 15 agents, in their suits up against the wall, our brand new phone bank that we had developed with call 1-800-CRIME TV. And we rolled the tape. Well, you were asking how it's put together. Field producers, Mr. Speaker, had made the segments that were the stories. It was started as a half-hour show. So they had made the stories, and then they were rolled together in a studio session where John Walsh would do the rap around the stories. And that night, we rolled our very first story featuring one of the FBI's 10 most wanted criminals. And he was a criminal monster. He was a prison escapee who had abducted a young woman with a baby, raped her, threw the baby out in the cold where it died, and stuffed her in the trunk of her car and took off. So we rolled our segment about that crime and that criminal. And the first thing that happened was a blanket of phone calls from Staten Island, New York. But they weren't calling to tell us congratulations. They were calling to tell us that we were soon going to be off the air because we had made a terrible mistake. This picture that they were looking at was the beloved director of their homeless mission there on Staten Island, and it couldn't possibly have been the man that we were looking for, but it was. And 5 days later, one of the FBI's 10 most wanted criminals was in custody. And we were a media phenomenon.
So this guy had committed that crime, but had gotten to Staten Island. Where was the crime committed?
Gary, Indiana.
Tells you the reach of television. I mean, you put him on TV and boom.
Absolutely. And somehow, in this case, I think fate also, because we were on a very short leash as to the future of that show. And it was only broadcast on 7 Fox-owned and operated stations nationwide. If he had been hiding out in some small town, we likely wouldn't have found him, and we likely wouldn't have been renewed for another season. So things happen for a reason.
Did capturing that criminal pretty much guarantee that you would go to the whole network?
Yes, absolutely. And maybe we would have anyway, but we felt we had to have one big capture to be picked up. That was our feeling.
What led you then to decide that you wanted to write about Oklahoma City?
Well, that was a long, and I really think odyssey, Mr. Speaker, is the right way to put it, because I had moved on from America's Most Wanted, but of course I had been in the cockpit of high-profile manhunts for 3 years. I mean, a regular journalist just doesn't get that close to how the FBI is capturing bad guys. But I did, and then moved on to Los Angeles. That was just a couple of years that I was out there working on developing a new show when this bomb exploded in Oklahoma City. And how I became involved in investigating the case takes another 10 years to explain. But when the bomb went off, I had 2 perspectives. One, just like millions of Americans, probably yourself, it's one of those rare moments where you remember where you were because it's just so profound. And I watched that devastation, which was almost immediately live on television, and saw the destruction, the agony, the fear, the blood, the concrete, all of it, the devastation, the children. As you know, the icon from that day is the firefighter holding the dying or dead 1-year-old. I saw all of that, and I felt all of that agony, but I also felt from my experience at America's Most Wanted, oh my God, this is the big one. This is the big manhunt because, of course, the perpetrators were gone and the hunt was on. And my thought was, who could have done this? So I became hooked on the story as a news junkie, as a horrified American. I wasn't working it, but I sure wished that I was back at America's Most Wanted in the middle of a newsroom where I could have chased that story and had the best sources in America, the cops and the federal agents that were on speed dial. That's how it struck me. There were many things. I don't want to get ahead here, but there were many reasons to wonder immediately about that story. And I think probably America's Most Wanted may have given me a head start, but I'm sure a lot of people wondered about discrepancies that arose immediately in that story. One of them was 24 eyewitnesses, regular, ordinary people in Oklahoma City, saw Timothy McVeigh and the man next to him arrive at the Murrah building to bomb the building and exit the Ryder truck before the bomb went off. So right away, a story that became lone wolf terror, the prosecution of Timothy McVeigh, obviously there was more to it than lone wolf terror. That was a first flag, if you will, that there was more to this story. And it immediately got magnified by stories. Top journalists were reporting in the best newspapers that the FBI had surveillance videotaped of the bombers and the bombing. So again, there were obviously more than one. And to me, really compelling is that a juror, a grand juror on the McVeigh grand jury was so disturbed by what was going on inside that jury that he went rogue. And of course, as you know, Mr. Speaker, the grand jury proceedings are, on the federal level especially, are very tightly kept secrets. He started leaking to the Oklahoma newspaper and then wrote a letter to the judge, actually written after the indictment came in. He complained bitterly that the prosecutors who were managing that grand jury had rigged it, and specifically rigged it by concealing the identity of John Doe 2. So to answer your question, there just were all these red flags as I was first fascinated by the story and then watching the story and then watching as the FBI by June of 1995 suddenly did a U-turn, called off the biggest manhunt in American history for John Doe 2, who had a $2 million reward for his capture, and came up with a preposterous explanation of how the mechanic at the Ryder rental truck agency must have misremembered the two men who came in to rent the bomb truck. He must have thought it was the two guys who were there the day before. And it was just a preposterous explanation. As the rogue grand juror said in an interview, oh my God, that was the thing that got my attention to begin with, that there was something wrong about this investigation.
I flew in the second night and went and visited the rescue workers. And it was really horrifying. Prior to 9/11, I don't think of anything quite like it on American soil. And I went back a few years ago to the museum they now have, which I really encourage all of our listeners, if you ever go to Oklahoma City. It's a very sobering and compelling experience to see just how much damage was done and how many innocent people were killed. But the museum doesn't really deal with the issue that your book, I think your book is going to really put back on the front burner some very significant questions. Now, you actually got to interview Nichols, is that correct? First of all, how did you get to do it? And second, what was it like?
Well, it was extraordinary. And how I got to do it takes a little bit of telling. It's 10 years in. I basically was summoned to Oklahoma City by a survivor who knew I was prowling around on the 10th anniversary thinking about a story for America's Most Wanted. And she called me and, without much introduction, just summoned me to Oklahoma City. We need your help out here. And it was just one of those moments. I just got on a plane and went to Oklahoma City and then went on to Salt Lake City, where she had pointed me to a man, an attorney named Jesse Trinidu, who becomes central in this investigation and is the reason I could interview Terry Nichols, who is off limits, was and is off limits to other reporters. Jesse believes that the FBI murdered his brother, who was a prisoner. Jesse is the lawyer in the family. His brother was a prisoner, a parole violator, arrested in Southern California in mid-June, right about the time the FBI was backing away from its John Doe 2 identification, kept in custody in Southern California for 2 months, and then suddenly and inexplicably transferred to Oklahoma City, supposedly for a parole violation hearing. But 3 days later, he was found tortured and murdered in his federal prison cell. And the connection to the Oklahoma City bombing, as Jesse would learn later, is that Kenneth Trinidu was a dead ringer lookalike for John Doe 2, the wanted poster that the FBI was seeking. He was muscularly built. He had the tattoo. He stood about the correct height and weight. And that began for Jesse, not yet for me, but for Jesse, the odyssey of connecting his brother's murder to the Oklahoma City bombing. That connection came incredibly, at first, from Timothy McVeigh himself on death row, who told Jesse, through another death row inmate, that the FBI had mistaken his brother for another man, Richard Guthrie, who was the leader of this Aryan Republican Army neo-Nazi group that figures in the bombing story. So Jesse was chasing all of that through a devoted circle of journalists who eventually surrounded him and became his brain trust, and went into federal court with FOIA demands and FOIA lawsuits to force information out of the FBI as to what really happened. And by the time I arrived on the scene, what Jesse needed was more information to file more Freedom of Information Act lawsuits. So he chose me as he says, stealth reporter who could go into the prisons because I was his paralegal. So that's how I interviewed Terry Nichols. And Jesse went with me on the first interview, and it was remarkable. Nichols had enticed us with the prospect that he was going to be able to help tie the Aryan Republican Army gang to the bombing. That isn't what materialized in that interview. Nichols had another agenda and made two extraordinary revelations in that interview. His interest, his agenda, was to incriminate this gun dealer named Roger Moore, who was always portrayed in these bombing prosecutions as the victim of Nichols and McVeigh's robbery that happened in late 1994. But Nichols claimed that Roger Moore was a government operative. My investigation leads to suspected government operative after suspected government operative until this story and case begins more and more to resemble the Governor Whitmer kidnap plot than the lone wolf terror plot that we have been told for 30 years. And Nichols had incredibly, from his Supermax prison cell, conducted an exhaustive investigation of Roger Moore and came up with very compelling evidence.
Wait a second, hold on. How do you do research from a Supermax?
Well, through your lawyers. So he had research from 2 bombing trials and very high profile legal representation. So he had a lot of stuff that was delivered in discovery to them. And he actually had quite a lot of exclusive material. And also, one of his most remarkable revelations was that in 2004, as he awaited his second trial, the state trial in Oklahoma, he was visited by an attorney who represented himself as an off-the-books envoy from the Department of Justice in Washington, offering Terry Nichols that the DOJ could take the death penalty off the table if he would help locate a box of explosives belonging to Roger Moore. Those explosives Nichols had taken in the robbery. What was significant to Nichols is that Moore's name and address was on that carton, and so were his fingerprints, which Nichols believed was going to tie him to the bombing, because Nichols claimed that Roger Moore not only was a government operative, but was a provocateur who provided explosives used in the bomb. The envoy, or supposed envoy from Washington, to Nichols' shock, the plea bargaining went sideways when Nichols said he certainly could, help incriminate Roger Moore. And he was told by the envoy that Roger Moore, and this is verbatim from Nichols, was untouchable. Another attorney of Nichols confirmed that this transaction actually happened, that this lawyer did show up, did make this offer, but that attorney concluded for some reason that this must have all been a hoax, but it did happen. Terry Nichols obviously had been seething for many years by the time I interviewed him, and he was a man shrunken with agony, almost fragile. He seemed to be in agony over more than he is ever admitted to. And he was just driven to deliver the case against Roger Moore. The other stunning highlight of the Nichols interview was his allegation that Timothy McVeigh, while they were in the run-up to the bombing, while they were conspiring and preparing, had let slip to Terry Nichols that he was operating as an undercover federal operative in the bomb plot. And that, of course, is a head-spinning idea when you first hear it. It has some support from other sources, but obviously coming from Terry Nichols, it's not going to stand on its own. But I will just mention a couple because you probably have that as a question. Timothy McVeigh told his first attorneys, who were public defenders, before he was quickly passed on to Stephen Jones. So within days and hours of the bombing itself, he told those attorneys that he was working undercover. And he told those attorneys that he was stunned by witnessing the damage done by the bomb, as if he did not believe that his bomb was going to bring that kind of devastation to the building. And he also wrote a letter to his sister, which was published in the New York Times at some point, telling her that he had been plucked out of special operations training, tryouts, and made part of this special undercover unit. So those were the really stunning headlines of the Terry Nichols interview.
In your judgment, looking at all the different stuff you're looking at, do you think that the FBI was trying to set up a sting and it got out of control?
Yes, I do. And there's, at the edge, I would say, of my investigation, again, this is the Jesse Trinidad, the attorney who is carrying the flag for all of these years. Eventually, in 2011, a fellow Marine of Jesse's comes out of the shadows and says, I've been following your crusade for justice for your brother. I want to tell you about the FBI's Patcon program. The whistleblower is John Matthews. He was a top FBI undercover in the program, which is short for Patriot Conspiracy, that was targeting right-wing extremist groups in the 1990s, before the bombing, and after, in fact. And the FBI represents this program as simply a limited infiltration program that targeted 3 groups. John Matthews, in his first phone call to Jesse, said, you wouldn't believe how big or how ugly this is. I want to come to Salt Lake City and tell you about it. He worked undercover in this program for 8 years, and he personally infiltrated 22 right-wing groups. He described it as a sprawling, rogue program that eventually he became so disillusioned about being part of that he left. But what his discovery was that it was inciting the violence that he believed he had joined up to stop. John Matthews was based in Arizona. He told Jesse that he believed Oklahoma City was a Patcon operation, and he told Jesse that he knew for a fact that the FBI set up the Aryan Republican Army gang as a front group inside Patcon. So the pieces begin to fall together about what really happened. And yes, my conclusion is that Oklahoma City was not an act of lone wolf terror by any stretch. It was manufactured terror. It was made in Washington, D.C. by the FBI, and it was tragically a sting operation that went sideways in somehow, as we still don't know and won't find out until we can learn the rest of the truth.
I have to ask you, because you've done so much research here and you have such great credibility as somebody who has worked with the FBI, understands the process, and is a good reporter. Doesn't this almost beg Kash Patel to go through and release the documents that would indicate exactly what was going on in that period?
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. Jesse Trinidu has a letter on the desk of Attorney General Bondi asking the Department of Justice to stand down from resisting the unsealing of the whistleblower, John Matthews' deposition, which would lay out in its entirety what Patcon was in the 1990s. And absolutely, this case, if I could just mention one last major feature of it, and it is the grand finale of this cover-up, is that John Matthews, first Newsweek jumped on the John Matthews story, and they did write a profile, a cover story about John Matthews. But on the day of, or the eve of publication, that story, under intense pressure from the Justice Department, was gutted in an executive edit, and all mention of Patcon, the Oklahoma City bombing, Timothy McVeigh under surveillance months before the bombing, all that was gone. The whistleblower was furious. He agreed, volunteered to be Jesse's star witness in the FOIA trial, seeking to force the FBI to release the videotapes, because those videotapes, which the FBI has never allowed the public to see, very likely would identify John Doe 2, perhaps identifying a federal undercover operative on the scene somewhere in the shot, and would tell the tale of what actually happened. On the eve of John Matthews' testimony, he pulled out of the trial, pulled out as a witness, told Jesse he had been pressured by the FBI, and that in almost a plea, he said, I don't want to be just another vet living under a bridge. He feared that his handlers would take his disability, his pension, and he was gone as the witness in the trial. Now, the trial, this is 2014, that trial was finished, and Jesse immediately filed formal witness tampering charges against the FBI, and the court appointed a special master to investigate those charges, but the judge said he was going to wait on the verdict in the surveillance videotapes case until that investigation was complete, and that was 11 years ago. So yes, I fully believe that in the spirit of the new transparency, that Kash Patel and Attorney General Bondi could open the door to the truth about this story. I also think we need to look at the cost of all of this silence. I mean, since the Oklahoma City bombing, we have had the Boston bombing, where there are serious suspicions that the older brother was an FBI informant. Now the Jeffrey Epstein story with potential of his connections to intelligence. January 6th, where Congress for 5 years has been trying to find out how many informants were on the ground. And just this week, Russian collusion and the questions of what role the FBI might have played in all of that. It boils down to a creeping surveillance crisis that urgently needs to be exposed.
You had mentioned the letter which is already on Attorney General Bondi's desk. Is that letter public?
Yes.
Margaret, this is an astonishing story. It's a great credit to you that you would put in this kind of time and that you bring your knowledge to bear. And I want to thank you for joining me. Your new book, Blowback, is available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere, and it certainly deserves to be a bestseller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. An honor to be with you.
Thank you to my guest, Margaret Roberts. You can get a link to buy her new book, Blowback, Oklahoma City and the Untold Story of the FBI's botched sting operation, on our show page at newsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Pendley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.